Welcome to Ideagen TV. Today we are ecstatic to have with us Simon Bland, the CEO of Glide. Simon, welcome.
Hi, George. Good to see you again.
Always great to see you, Simon, and it's so great to have you back on Ideagen TV. To kick off this interview, we all just came off of this very interesting, let's call it an interesting 2020, with all of the challenges that we're all aware of with the situation, obviously, of the global pandemic. And Simon, we've seen your leadership. We understand how critical it is to lead, because we do believe that it starts at the top, right? You set the tone. Why is leadership, Simon, more crucial now than ever? And what does true leadership mean to you? And in addition, how would you define it?
So thanks, George. And you're right, 2020 was a very challenging year. 2021 is going to be plenty challenging as well. And I think many of us recognize that we're certainly not through this pandemic, and the adjustments and changes that we've all been forced to make are likely to continue to influence our lives for the foreseeable future. So plenty of challenges to come. George, I was reading back on some old notes of conversations we've had in the past, and it's great to speak to you again. And we had talked about leadership a little before. I find it quite hard to define, really. A phrase that I really enjoyed was something an old boss of mine, Suma Chakrabarti, the old permanent secretary of DFID, said of leadership: you know it when you see it and you miss it when you don't. And I think you're alluding to the fact that the importance of leadership to really sort of set direction, inspire and motivate and facilitate action. I take but perhaps a slightly different view, where I think you say it starts at the top, and maybe it's important at the top in helping set leadership, set direction, but I think it's also really important elsewhere at the bottom as well. So, I think about a couple of things. I think about, what's the old saying? Is it, management's doing things right and leadership is doing the right things. So figuring out strategically, where you need to go, and then tactically how you get there, I think is super important. And you don't need a title to be a leader. And in all talks that I gave around the HIV/AIDS response, I think there were no greater exemplars of leadership than frontline workers, people like Elizabeth Taylor, Lady Diana, Princess of Wales, who really brought a human, empathetic approach to trying to break down these notions of stigma and discrimination and basically fear and anxiety. And if you look at the Ebola crisis in West Africa and more recently in DRC, seeing frontline workers really there exhibiting all the characteristics of personal sacrifice, care of others, seems to me to be a really important feature of leadership. So I think it really is that sort of front line where I get great inspiration from. I guess the final thing on leadership for me, it comes from Marty Linsky, used to work at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he talked about leadership in terms of tough decisions, sacrifice, and managing the distribution of loss. There are very few win-win scenarios around. There's a lot of scenarios where there are losses, and you need to distribute that loss. And leadership is about making the decisions about how you manage that. And I think that's crucially important. And maybe we'll touch on that if we talk a little bit more about sort of COVID and vaccinations, because there are no straightforward, easy answers for any leader here. And I think I've heard a number of sort of leaders, presidents, prime ministers say there are no easy answers to this. There isn't, an easy right and wrong. There's a series of really tough decisions to make. and leadership has to make those very tough decisions. So 2020 has brought out the need for that. 2021, I think, will continue to demand exemplary leadership and tough decisions on how one manages this distribution of loss.
That's right, Simon. It's incredible to hear your perspective. I love that quote. You know it when you see it, and you miss it when you don't. That's going to stick with me because I think that's so right. It's so true of so many things, but especially leadership. You understand that you don't need a title, as you mentioned. You know, you don't need to have that title. And it is important to clarify, I believe, that it's not, when we think of leadership, it is the CEO, but it's also that frontline worker, that person in the field who's also leading. So let's redefine leadership as what that is and what is important here, because I think you bring up a very, very, very critical point, that you may have the title, but you can also be leading without that title. Okay, Simon, running off that question, why do you believe it is more important now than ever to have this strong and effective leadership, both, again, defined by the title and those without the title? Why is that so critical?
So I think as we continue to see the pandemic spread, we'll continue to see infections. We'll have breakthroughs and we'll make progress, but there's no quick, easy end in sight. We're going to continue to depend on those frontline workers everywhere, and that's not just healthcare workers. That's teachers. That's sort of primary industry producers. It's those that really keep economies running and serve to keep people safe. They're going to continue to have heavy demands on them. I mean, we've seen people pretty exhausted over the last year, and yet continuing to deliver. And while some may have thought that this will be a sprint, it's clearly a marathon. And so we're going to continue to see the need for that dedication, and that leadership. I think as we think about the distribution of vaccines, there are some profoundly difficult political choices to make between protecting one nation's population versus thinking about a more global response. And there's a lot of modeling that will demonstrate and show, I think, quite clearly that the quickest way out of the pandemic, and perhaps the least harmful way out of the pandemic, is a much more collaborative global response. But that's a profoundly difficult thing for national politicians to do, where their responsibility is to protect their citizens, and making the argument of a global response being better for protecting citizens rather than taking the vaccine next week, but delay your vaccine for a while until we get frontline and vulnerable workers everywhere vaccinated, is a difficult argument to make, and it will take leadership. So I think we're going to continue to see some difficulties. We're seeing, I think, the beginnings of this. I think we're seeing countries recognizing that they need to give up some of their vaccines. There's arguments for a people's vaccine. There's growing demand, I think, for a more equitable distribution. But none of these decisions are going to be straightforward or easy, and they are going to take strong leadership at the global level. We're seeing that, but strong leadership at the national level, and again, managing that distribution of loss and the sacrifices we have to make to do that. So I think more than ever, we're going to need that character of leadership to help us get out of this as quickly as we can.
That's such a great point, and we're seeing it play out in nations across the world as the vaccination programs unfold, right? And we're seeing what you're alluding to, which is choices. Choices must be made. As you know, in the United States, I think there's leadership, coming out of Washington, and then there's the individual states and their governors who determine specifically who is in, first or second or third in line to get this vaccine. And typically it will be, the 75 plus or 65 plus, and then we go down the list of folks with pre-existing conditions, et cetera. And so as you lead up, Glide, the Global Institute for Disease Elimination. What are you seeing in terms of the global population getting vaccinated? So what are you seeing right now? And do you see, this is the question, we're all asking this question, do you see an end to this pandemic coming relatively soon?
So just going back quickly, George, to your point of the over 80s, the over 70s, the over 60s, frontline healthcare workers, those with underlying conditions, and you go through that prioritization, and that all looks very sensible. At some point, a country asks the question, do we do our over 40s before actually we contribute vaccines to vulnerable people elsewhere? That's that profound challenge that I think politicians are going to face this year. Look, there's been an unprecedented pace of development for a whole host of vaccines in less than a year. This sort of scientific breakthroughs that we've seen, I think there's an enormous amount to learn from that and inspiration to be taken from that. There are new approaches to vaccine development that we hadn't seen before. The technologies that Pfizer and Moderna have used for messenger RNA approaches, groundbreaking, never been used in humans before, with highly efficacious results coming from trials and now from increasingly widespread distribution of the vaccine. So there's a lot to be really encouraged by that. I think Johnson & Johnson was just approved, if I understand. We have Novavax, we have AstraZeneca, we have Sputnik, we have Sinopharm. So there's a whole range of vaccines there and tools that we should be incredibly grateful for and inspired by, and hope that we learn lessons from this in the future for other challenges that we face. But just having a quick look today, I think there's around a little over 200 million doses have been given. That's 3% of the global population. So we're only just beginning with this. We really are at the very early stages of this. And getting this rapidly expanded and distributed to the world's population is clearly going to take some considerable time. That's why the prioritization of the vaccine to the most vulnerable everywhere first seems to be a much better response than this sort of vaccine nationalistic approach, which is we'll just do all our population, then we'll worry about the rest of the world. I think Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, called this a catastrophic moral failure. And so that's that leadership question again, is how do we take a global approach to produce global solutions for global problems, and not an individual, every country from themselves, because that won't get us out of this. The Global Institute for Disease Elimination, where I work, is very specifically thinking about the elimination of disease. Now, if eradication is the elimination of a disease in all countries, it's eradicated. It's no longer seen, except perhaps in laboratories. And there's only one human disease that's been eradicated, and that's smallpox. We've come close, and we are close with polio, but it remains a challenge towards the end. We're very close with guinea worm disease. There are a few other diseases which we have high ambitions for. And then there are a range of other diseases that we can eliminate within geographic areas. And people ask me, are we going to eliminate or eradicate COVID? And I think the answer is no, certainly not in the foreseeable future. I think we're going to be living with COVID for a number of years. Now, that's not the end of the world. We've learned to live with a lot of diseases. We live with the common cold. We live with flu. So we have vaccines. We can have more vaccines developed to address variants and mutations. My hope is we'll see increasingly effective therapies. We have remdesivir, we have dexamethasone, we have monoclonal antibodies and other therapies, but research on colchicine and ivermectin and other things. So having an arsenal of weapons to treat this disease, to prevent it becoming a serious disease and to prevent hospitalizing, means that we can live with this, if we have to. So it's not the end of the world if we can't eliminate and eradicate. And I certainly don't think we're going to for the foreseeable future.
You mentioned messenger RNA. It seems to me, reading the reports of what this is and the process that was developed by Pfizer and Moderna, et cetera, is this also a silver lining potentially in terms of other diseases? Do you see that as a new way to maybe tackle? Does it have potential to tackle cancers and certain things like that?
Well, look, I'm no vaccinologist or virologist, but the technology is really pretty cool, and it looks like it's highly adaptable. And so this is the first time it's been used in humans, as far as I understand, and it's being used at scale. And we expect to see modifications to these vaccines being made to tackle the variants that we're seeing. So yes, look, I think through history, human ingenuity leads to sometimes sort of leapfrogs, and that could be it could be one of the things that one gets from this pandemic is is new technologies that can be adapted and utilized for other challenges that have thus far stymied us. So it is really interesting. I mean, I'm reminded by a statistic I read a while ago. We also have an awful lot of diagnostic tests for COVID. I get tested on a very regular basis here in Abu Dhabi. They have a fantastic testing scheme here. And I don't know how many different tests have been developed over the last year, but the statistic I read is there have been more diagnostic tests developed for COVID in 12 months than there have for all neglected tropical diseases in the last 100 years. So if we can take some of this ingenuity, some of this passion, some of this investment, some of the new technologies and adapt those for sort of more ancient challenges, that would be a remarkable benefit of this awful tragedy that so many people have seen. So yes, George. I mean, I think the short answer is we're very hopeful that some of this can be adapted.
That's it's nice to be hopeful, especially after this, this past year plus. And I'd like to ask you just off script, how you feel about rebuilding versus reimagining.
So, what's the saying in when we have a humanitarian catastrophe? Is we aim to build back better. If people keep saying, when will we get back to normal? And I've heard other commentators say, well, we don't want to get back to that normal. We want to get back to a new normal, a normal that recognizes the weaknesses and challenges and vulnerabilities that old normal had, and build in a way that sort of mitigates that vulnerability and protects against that vulnerability. And so if one imagines, a world where we have better healthcare everywhere, better systems for healthcare everywhere, then perhaps that leads us to a better place and a more secure place. So imagine this: we have 20 neglected tropical diseases that are neglected. The people are neglected and the diseases are neglected. They've been around for millennia. 1.7 billion people are susceptible to these diseases, and yet the world hasn't really come forward with great technological advances and progress. We're making huge strides on some of them, but they persist. Now imagine this. Imagine if we invested in and supported systems for health at that front line that help tackle these diseases, because it's very cheap, honestly, to deal with them. But you build those systems, and with those systems, you have surveillance and early warning. Then all of a sudden, the world has this ability of picking up potential pathogens and challenges much earlier, and is able to take action much earlier. And so, if we neglect these people and neglect these diseases, we're almost neglecting our own safety, security, and indeed survival. So when I reimagine this, I say, let's make the case for much greater attention, investment, and effective work, and technological breakthroughs and innovations to support systems for health across the globe, because it is really in our self-interest. And if we don't get that now, we never will. If we don't get that someone falling sick in a different part of the world can have a profound impact, not only on our own health and safety, but our economies and livelihoods and societies. If this hasn't demonstrated that, then I'm not sure what will. So that's the reimagining that I think we have to do, and we have to make the case that says we must, as a globe, come together to provide the solutions that we need as a globe to help tackle this. So I'm hopeful, but equally somewhat cynical that the world will do that, because we often have short memories and we tend to forget. So our job is to really make that case very strongly, and make that case in a way that is supported by evidence that we know what we're doing, that we know that we can support these systems of health, or help countries improve their own systems for health in a way that benefits all of us.
Those are just profound insights, Simon. You always bring optimism in reality. So that combination of the optimism and realistic sense of where we're heading, because it is for the planet, truly, at least in my lifetime, the most unique moment, and we can all agree. And it would be tragic on some level to forget what we're going through, and just go right back to where we were, when there have been so many incredible advances that we've made. Telemedicine, you can see your doctor on your phone. Well, maybe that's much more efficient than going into the office and actually being exposed to others with other colds or flus or whatever it may be, viruses, etc. That's just one example. These efficiencies in work, as we've all seen, the ability to be anywhere and work remotely. So I think there's an incredible opportunity, but to your point, I think it's important to remember what we're going through, so that we never ever have to go through this again. And when we know there are different, like you mentioned, tropical diseases out there that can do the same thing and wreak havoc across the world, we should be investing in eradicating those. So I want to commend you for highlighting that, obviously, because it's profound. Now, this drives us to the next point in this interview, this profound interview, where at Ideagen, we've known you, Simon, for many years now, from when you're at UNAIDS and now CEO of Glide. We're focused on cross-sector partnerships and developing a common language across the sectors, because therein lies one barrier to innovation, to collaboration, to conversation. If you simply can't understand the vernacular of another sector, how have you and your colleagues worked with other organizations to get through and to persevere throughout this past year?
Thanks, George. I want to just go back and pick up one thing you just said about neglected tropical diseases. I don't worry that those diseases that we've already identified that have been around for millennia are suddenly going to jump and cause problems for the rest of the world. But these zoonotic jumps of other diseases and viruses, having good, strong systems where these neglected diseases are, where we're tackling those diseases, also provide this early warning for other potential threats. So that's where I think the real utility and value and the case should be made on neglecting these for no longer. Look, it's been a tough year for many people. Incredibly hard for so many who've lost loved ones, lost their lives, lost livelihoods. We've adapted. I took up this job at the end of 2019, and it was in the first quarter of 2020 that the world largely went into lockdown. I was fortunate to get several months of sort of engagement and travel and understanding in those early months. Glide is very much the new kid on the block in terms of a new institution working in this space, although we're building on years of philanthropic experience and generosity from Abu Dhabi and the UAE, particularly around polio, malaria, and some of these neglected diseases. But we've been able to develop some new partnerships. We've been able to sort of engage and work with the Carter Center, with Sight Savers, with New York University, with the University of California in San Francisco. We're working with the Ministry of Health in Malawi, with the Ministry of Health in Cameroon, and we've found ways of doing that through this virtual technology. So it's been harder in some ways, but it's also been interesting as we experiment with new ways of working. We brought on a team virtually. Some of us have never met, and we've been working now together for 6 or 8 months, and we're finding our sea legs and accelerating the pace. And so that's the way we've been able to work, really drawing on the experience of others, seeing how we can help others go further and faster, and how we can learn from those experiences. I mean, you make a hugely important point, George, and Ideagen is to be congratulated for this. Many of these challenges that the world face will not have single sector solutions. They need multi-sectoral approaches. If we think about neglected diseases, we have to think about education. We have to think about water, sanitation, hygiene. I mean, one of the things around COVID is the importance of sanitation and hygiene. And just those messages can also promulgate better practice and perhaps better infrastructure to help tackle NTD. So the synergies are clearly there. And we'll continue to push the boundaries for that cross-sectoral thinking. But as I say, the whole world has had to adapt. I mean, I think we've got a whole new nomenclature now because of virtual meetings, and humanity is wonderful because we find lots of things to laugh about. But I don't know how many times I've been told, "You're on mute, Simon. You're on mute." And that's just the world we now live in. So we've adapted, and we'll continue to adapt because I think we're going to be working in this fashion for the foreseeable future.
It's first of all, I thank you for that incredibly in-depth, sort of an insightful review, because it is interesting to hear, to see, to understand that resilience of the human spirit, despite what we've endured throughout this time. It's really remarkable. And I'd like to ask you to really dive a little bit deeper into your work at Glide and this hyper focus over the last year for the search for a vaccine, for the development of a vaccine. We've seen Alex Borla at Pfizer, a completely new process, as you mentioned, messenger RNA. Fantastic. But at the same time, have we seen a decrease in the study and attack on other infectious diseases? And how much has the pandemic perhaps set us back, if at all, in terms of eliminating other neglected diseases like tropical diseases?
So it's difficult to quantify. Some early modeling in malaria that the World Health Organization did hypothesized that the worst case scenario would set back malaria progress by a couple of decades. Now that hasn't come to pass at the moment, although we're still dealing with the pandemic, and we're still seeing numbers increasing in Africa. It clearly disrupted mass drug administrations for a number of neglected diseases. Some of these programs are catching up. And there's been some modeling about what are going to be the implications of that, and it depends on how long it's delayed and how many times it's delayed. I mean, I think we all fear And I think intuitively we know that this is likely to mean more neglect, not less neglect, unless we do that reimagining, George, that you talked about. Funds have been diverted from work on neglected diseases. Assets have been diverted from polio programs. So, for example, in Pakistan, the polio program was repurposed to deal with COVID, and that's not a bad thing. In many ways, it shows that adaptability, and the fact that you have that system and that those assets in place means that they could respond much more quickly. But it did put vaccinations back by 6 months that they're now trying to catch up with. And so we're seeing sort of these delays and these interruptions. We know that economies are going to shrink. We see policy shifts in the UK. We saw a policy shift around official development assistance. And so money's going to be tighter. And there's going to be increasing calls for that money to, sort of try and prevent another pandemic, learn lessons from that. And so it's going to be difficult to get one's hands on the money. And so I think it's going to be incumbent on us to make that case for integration and that case for the synergies across sectors and across diseases, and build those systems for health rather than just tackling individual diseases. And if we can do that in a way that is not only morally the right thing to do, but clearly it makes the self-interest case, and I think we stand a chance. So yes, I think it certainly set the world back. It set the Sustainable Development Goal back without any doubt. How far and for how long, I think, remains to be seen, and will partly be determined by how the world responds once we get out of the acute phase of a pandemic, and people start caring less about it and more about other things. I think our job is to try and sort of make it easy for people to continue to care, but give them hope that we have solutions. And for me, those solutions are going to be much more integrated across diseases than they have been in the past.
Well, that's really inspiring, and on many levels, good news. It's a bit of good news from the standpoint of perspective and the reality of where we are today, which leads us to a really sort of pivotal moment in this interview, Simon, which is a focus on GLIDE again, the Global Institute for Disease Elimination, and your goals for 2021 and beyond. How are you going to achieve them? And what are they?
So, our vision is a world free from these preventable infectious diseases of poverty. There is no reason why in this 21st century anyone should live with a guinea worm in their body and go through this tortuous process of having this worm removed from them. And the good news is that the work of the UAE, His Highness, and the Carter Center is making great progress on guinea worm. There's no reason anyone should go blind from a parasitic worm. There's no reason that people should see distorted limbs from filariasis infections. There is just really no excuse for that in this modern age. And so that's our vision, and our mission is to help accelerate the thinking and progress towards making that a reality. It's a high ambition. It's an ambition that is more realizable for some diseases than others. But as technologies and tools change, it will become more realizable for others. We want to continue to raise awareness and understanding about these diseases. We want to continue to raise awareness and understanding about the opportunities of elimination and why that's important. We want to support the development and implementation of elimination strategies, and we want to foster new approaches and innovations to help make this work. As I said before, I think our ambition is to learn from others, learn from the front line where they've been dealing with these issues for so long, learn from partners that have lots of experience, work in ways that helps those partners go further and faster towards their goals. And I guess, I wanted to sum it up. And I talked with with my communications manager earlier today about this. I like the idea of saying we want to accelerate. I think we're going to have to integrate, and if we do that, we might just mitigate the next challenge, because the next big global challenge, because there will be another one. There's no doubt there will be another one. And it would be a tragedy and a travesty if the world didn't learn lessons from this one, and put in place the measures it needed to be better equipped and better prepared the next time. And I hope we can play a little part in that through this system strengthening of systems and integrated approaches.
Integrated approaches, you're leading to help eliminate diseases across the planet that can affect humanity, especially those most at need and most vulnerable, which is incredible, Simon. And I think if there's any takeaway from today's interview, as always profound, as always incredibly insightful, it's that the next iteration, it's highly likely that there will be another pandemic. We must learn from this one, and we must take away that integrative piece from a global standpoint to be better prepared, to be prepared in general. There are many people that have talked about, the potential of a pandemic for many years, including, I think, Bill Gates back several years.
2015, absolutely. Yep.
And it's now 2021, and here it is. Here it arrived in 2020, 5 years later. And yet we were still not prepared because, as always, we sort of react. And this isn't something you can react to when literally the entire globe came to a complete shutdown. I think it's going to be hard to forget, I believe, for many.
I hope so, George. I hope so. I think our job is to make it hard to forget. I think, and make it easy to learn the lessons. And this notion of saying, well, we need to be more integrated. It's a very easy thing to say. It's not an easy thing to do, and we have to learn lessons and figure out how that works. And we are doing some work on, how one can make integration a reality and understand, when one can integrate, when one should integrate, and when one can't and shouldn't, because it's not straightforward, but it's going to be part of the solution going forward.
Simon Bland, CEO of GLIDE, the Global Institute for Disease Elimination. What is your call to action for our global audience?
Hang on in there, I think. Persevere, and don't forget. There are many lessons from this, and we must not forget those. We can be better prepared in the future, and I think being better prepared for the future involves taking a keener interest on others elsewhere than we perhaps have in the past. So let's stop the neglect.
And how can folks across the planet find out more information about your incredible work at GLIDE?
We're on the web. We're glide.ae, so you can find our website there. And if you want to email us, info@glideae.org.
Simon Bland, CEO of the Global Institute for Disease Elimination, leadership defined, changing the world, and providing insights so that we never forget and are able to persevere. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks a lot, George. Great to see you.
Bye.